Hello, everyone. So welcome to this Hangout on Air today with Cris Turple. Cris Turple is an MYP language and literature teacher and a former technology coach at the Canadian International School in Singapore. And we are here today to talk about copyrights, Creative Commons, public domain, and how do we work with this gray area with our students. My name is Fanny Passport. I work at the Mercedes-Benz International School in Pune in India. And Cris and I met at a NetTech Team Summit featuring the Google Apps for Education. And we decided to do this today because we think this is an important topic. So Cris, would you like to guide us in this topic with perhaps why we are talking about this today?
Absolutely. So first off, just thank you, Fanny, so much for having me. And I do want to say just off the bat that I'm not an expert in any way on this topic. I'm just another educator who's sort of been researching this because I do feel like it's a very important thing for our students to know. And I guess this pursuit of figuring out the copyright and Creative Commons really started when I was teaching grade 8. And I was teaching English as my subject, and I had this fabulous idea that I would get my students to create book trailers about the book that we were reading. And I thought, oh, this is fantastic. This is a great way to integrate technology. And so my kids worked for weeks putting together images and some stock footage to create their own movie trailers for their books. And then I had all the students upload their videos onto YouTube. And what happened was 90% of them got stripped down for copyright infringement. And I remember sitting in my class and the kids were asking me, like, why? Why did it get taken down? And not knowing the answer. And I think that's what happens a lot in copyright is we don't necessarily understand the rules. And so what I did for that year was that we spent the rest of the year figuring out together what copyright really means in relation to them and in the schooling system. So that was a big lesson for me, and through the completion of my master's in educational technology, we explore this topic of digital citizenship in depth. And digital citizenship comes up continuously. We have our common sense media badges that a lot of people have. The ISTE standards mentions digital citizenship as a competency that students should have. And even the most recent Horizon reports mentions this idea that students need to understand how to legally and ethically use information from online. So this trend was something that I started exploring as a classroom teacher, and as I moved into the realm of technology coaching, it was a large, substantial part of my job to understand what this meant for the teachers and students at the school. And now being back in the classroom as an English teacher again, I continue to integrate this into my practice. So I'm really excited to talk about this subject because it's something that I have spent a lot of time on and I think is very valuable in our modern day curriculum.
Thank you, Cris. That's a great introduction to the topic. Recognizing that this, like the real implication in the classroom, and this anecdote is familiar to me because that happened to me once, and this was also a big realization that, you know, I want to know more, and I want to be responsible and a model for my students. So I think the teachers are really willing to learn, but they are unsure and they really need to get started with the first few steps. So would you like to talk to us about the different types of material we can find?
Sure. So as I started this pursuit into this realm of copyright, creativity, one of the texts that really stood out to me was a book called Free Culture. And this is by Lawrence Lessig, who is attached to the Creative Commons organization. But his book talks about how copyright and all of the laws surrounding it actually stifles creativity because it puts all these restrictions on what we can do. And that's a big reaction I would hear from a lot of teachers is, I don't worry about copyright because it's just all about learning here, and it doesn't matter whether we use copyrighted materials. And what Lawrence Lessig talks about throughout his book is he gives his own anecdotes about how copyright does restrict our culture, but he also talks a lot about this gray area of copyright. The fact that copyright laws haven't caught up to where our society is now with the emergence of these new technologies and all of the connections that we so easily have at our fingertips. The laws aren't necessarily keeping up with the ethics of what we know to be right and wrong. So through that text, it sort of pointed me towards this idea of Creative Commons, which was a new term to me when I first started this. I knew copyright, I didn't understand Creative Commons, and so maybe that would be a good place to start, is looking at the difference between the public domain, Creative Commons, and copyright. And I usually break this down for teachers and students as a sort of traffic light. So our green light is public domain, meaning anything with this label is good to be used. It typically includes books that have come out of copyright because it's been a certain amount of years since the authors died, or just creators who have said, you can do anything with my work. So public domain is our green light. Our yellow light is our Creative Commons. And so this is works that the producers have labeled as something you can use, but you must follow some of the rules that they set up. Typically, it has to do with attribution, so giving credit to the author. And then over in our red light, that would be our copyright. And this is content that is protected by law. And so when we consider ethics as well, if the author doesn't want you using their work, then ethically it's sort of off limits as well. So green light, yellow light, red light is usually the breakdown for how we label our information online.
I really like how you talked about this. It was very visual for me, and it makes so much sense. I like it. I think I'm going to sketch note it. Okay, so now we know there are 3 different things that we can start with as a teacher. Would you be able to give us details about each?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the public domain, there's not as much information that can be found in that realm. I actually tend to focus most of my efforts on the yellow, on the Creative Commons, because I think that's where the learning needs to happen for the kids and teachers, is understanding what the rules mean and what those labels are. So actually, I'm just going to share my screen and we can have a look at what that is. Okay, so on the screen, can you see the different sorts of Creative Commons labels?
I can't see the screen yet.
Okay. Let me pull it up.
Okay, I think it's coming now. Yes.
You can see now? Okay.
Yes.
So this is where I tend to spend the most time, and there's 4 basic labels that are used by the Creative Commons. Now I consider this just sort of the language that we can share across different platforms, because if we were all using different language, it would be sort of confusing about what we can do with that information. So these 4 labels, the first one is attribution, which is giving credit to the author. So if you see this little person and it's just the little person, it means you can do anything with that work, whether it's a picture or a video or a song, whatever it is, but you need to give credit. The second symbol, it looks like an equal sign, and this is for no derivative works, meaning you can use a work, but you can't change it in any way. I typically steer students away from this label because if they were going to take an image and put it on their on a slideshow, but then put text over top of it, they're technically changing what that image is. So I try to stay away from this label, but it's not one of the more common ones anyway. The third symbol is share alike, which means that the author has stated you can use their work, but then you yourself also have to enter your work, whatever you create, back into the Creative Commons. So it's this sort of pay it forward idea. And I have a lot of really great discussions with students about the ethics surrounding this idea. Like, is it right to use someone else's work, but then copyright your own work? It doesn't really seem fair. So I try to push students to also share back their work out into our connected world. So they're sort of part of that participatory culture. And the final one, non-commercial, meaning you can take and use someone else's work, but you can't make money off it. And this is great in a school setting because our kids aren't making money off what they're producing. So this opens up the doors to a lot of content that's available online. Now in international schools, we kind of have this issue of, well, if our school is a for-profit, isn't this kind of breaking the non-commercial clause? And the answer is no, because it's not actually the school, it's the student's work. So as long as the student's not making money, then it still falls under this non-commercial label. On the left-hand side, you can see sort of the breakdown of what the combinations could look like as you identify different photos online. I'll show you a couple places of where these labels come into play. And what I do with the kids is we practice, right? I give them small tasks and say, find a picture that's free to use on this topic. And we do lots of really short practice activities. So one of the first places where this sort of terminology comes into play is Google Images. So can you see the Google Images on my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to search for unicorns, my favorite thing to research. And if we are on a Google image search page, up in Tools, one of the options is Usage Rights. And we have the different categories labeled here. So one's labeled for reuse with modification. So although the wording's a little bit different, this is the Creative Commons label, that no derivative, the derivative one. And down here, the non-commercial, you can see how that links back to the Creative Commons. So I try to stay away from the modification ones, and I always push the students to go into the non-commercial reuse because it seems to bring back the most results. So now they can pick a picture about a unicorn, and it's free to use, and when they cite it, you can typically tell in the URL whether they've used a free to use image, because it'll have something like a wiki or a commons listed in the URL.
So you would ask them to share the URL as a way to cite where they got the image from?
Yeah, so I like to get students in the habit of always citing everything. Even if it's from the public domain, I want them to give credit to the author. So I get them in the habit of sharing and properly citing their sources. And as a teacher, just a quick way to check whether they've done this is typically in the URL. You can see something like free wiki in it. So let's see. So here for this unicorn, you can see in the URL underneath it says commons.wikimedia. That commons means it's from the Creative Commons. So it's an easy way to check. Another great place to find images is Flickr. They also have a really easy filter for finding Creative Commons materials. So up here on the left, they have an option for all Creative Commons. So now I can look for images in the Creative Commons, and if I click into a picture, Flickr, you can see here, uses the exact Creative Commons labels that I previously went over. So here, because I would have pre-taught the students what the different symbols mean, we can see that this unicorn picture can be used, but I must give attribution or credit, and I can't make money off of the picture.
So here, would you put the name of the author and the URL as a way to attribute?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's different formatting, whether you're doing MLA or APA, but definitely the author's title, the picture title, and typically the students will say retrieved from and put the URL in there. And I like them to always include the URL, because then I can either see right from the URL that it's free to use, or I can click in and then check the label myself. So what I found over the last few years is more and more websites are getting on board with the Creative Commons terminology. More and more platforms that I visit use those Creative Commons symbols as a way to explain what you can and can't do with the content. So I've found that it's gotten easier and easier for students to identify what they can and can't use, because that Creative Commons labeling is just becoming so commonplace.
That's right. I really like how you strived how you emphasize on really the learning aspect of this, and especially if you're taking public domain. So when I taught the public domain to the students, the first thing was like, oh, I'm just going to use public domain now. I don't have to give credit. So I think it's important to really expect them to cite anyway, even if it's public domain. And would you be able to talk to us about fair use in copyright? For example, a student is reusing a copyrighted material. He has not used the filters on the Google images. What would be the implication? And yeah, what would be the implication of this?
Yeah, sure. So when I was located in Hong Kong, we were in this really unique situation where it was a Canadian school located in Hong Kong, using a lot of American or European resources, and each of those countries has their own copyright law. And so a lot of teachers we were confused, right? Like, what do we follow? What do we do? And I'd say the number one response when I first started bringing this idea of copyright to the professional development for the teachers was a response of, well, it's fair use. We're educators, and so we're covered by fair use. And it's sort of this blanket statement. However, fair use is part of the American copyright law. So in actuality, although a lot of the resources we use, such as YouTube, are American and would follow that fair use law, if we're using them within a geographical location that's outside of America, actually whatever country you are in, those are the copyright laws that apply. So in Hong Kong, it was actually very strict copyright rules, and in no way was fair use a sort of protected for the teachers. One of the things to consider with the fair use, if teachers aren't protected by it in the country that they're residing in, is this idea of public versus private. Most countries, if you go through the copyright laws, make a distinction between things just publicly posted and things you have behind a password, such as on a Moodle or a Google Classroom or something that needs to be logged into. Copyrighted content can, in some cases, be used as long as it's password protected. And so fair use, I think it's not always the law, depending on where you are, but I also think it's a bit of an ethical cop-out where we're just avoiding the topic and not going down and exploring those gray areas alongside the kids so that they can, in the future, figure out what that means for them when they're creating, producing sort of texts or digital elements, because eventually they're going to graduate outside of school and not be in that educational realm. And I think it's important for them to already understand what they can and can't do legally and ethically with online information.
Okay, that was a really good point to mention that fair use doesn't apply everywhere. I'm thinking this is another, like, I'm still questioning then what is plagiarism, because we are plagiarizing if we are taking a photo, a copyrighted material. So I'm thinking of the students and they're writing their essays and they're taking copyrighted material, but they are citing, that they're quoting, for example, or they're reusing an image and they are giving the full source within the style of referencing. It's still not possible to be, it's still not ethical, right?
Right, and I love as an English teacher, I love the analogy, the comparison. I think they are so similar, because as an English teacher, if a student is submitting an essay and they've taken a line from a website and I see that, I know that that's not right. Even though I may not know the legal laws behind it, I know ethically that that's not right. And I think what's happening with the digital content is we're not quite at the point where we've grown up with the technology to just know what's right and wrong. But to me, this idea of copyrighted digital content is just like plagiarizing for an essay. It's the visual plagiarizing of someone else's work. And so the laws are still sort of unclear. There's a lot of gray area of what is and isn't okay. And that's why I sort of lean on those Creative Commons labels when they're using the content. I like to teach them actually together. So as I'm teaching the students about what they can and can't take as text on websites, have the conversation about what we can and can't take as the images from the same websites, why we can or cannot use those in our own work as well.
Okay, so really the reflection is happening in the classroom. This is something that there should be a dialogue, and there should be, the teacher should be confident to have a transparent dialogue with the students about it, to find out together and really be reflective. Would you be able to share some of your resources when it comes to searching for Creative Commons material? And oh, sorry, you just shared some of them, but I think you had how do we find other things like images, for example, sound, music? What would you suggest?
So I have a couple favorites where I usually point the students in the direction of. What I found is, instead of giving them too many options, I find giving them 2 or 3 different places to go seems to work a lot better. And the key here is practice, right? They're not doing this for the first time when they have an assignment due, but we're constantly practicing, even just as a warm-up activity at the start of class. Okay, who's the first person who can find me a picture of an orange that's free to use, and credit the author, you know, and they just kind of get in the habit of being able to do that. So my favorites for finding images is first off, the Google image search that I showed, just because it's a simple filter on a tool that they're already using. Flickr, I find, has more realistic photographs, as opposed to Google search. You mostly find clip art and cartoonish looking things. So I like to give those 2 options as different types of pictures. And then so the third is Noun Project, which provides a lot of icons that are free to use. So I teach them that these are the best places to go depending on what kind of picture you're looking for. For music, a lot of my students are already on SoundCloud, and so SoundCloud has built-in Creative Commons filters. So I just showed them with a tool they already use how the Creative Commons filters work. And the other one that I tend to go to is Free Music Archives. And this one's really great for instrumental music, for backgrounds of videos and things like that. And it categorizes them by genres, so it's a bit easier to find what you're looking for. Again, that one, all of the music there is free to use. So if students are struggling with the labels, or they're just learning the labels, I like to send them there because they know everything then on that site. They can use any of that music. For stock footage, like videos, I like, again, to use Flickr because they would have already been familiar with it from images, and Flickr has the Creative Commons labels for their videos. But probably the number one thing that my students try to do for videos is take YouTube videos, download YouTube videos, and then use them in their own work. And so even if you're in America and you're covered by fair use, YouTube policies state that you can't download videos. So I always steer my students away from YouTube videos because even though they know how to download them and put them in their work, we have that conversation of, well, it explicitly tells you not to do that. And so it doesn't seem very ethical, and it's not legal to do. So I steer them away from that. With the younger kids, when I was a technology coach and I worked with the younger grades and they were just being introduced to this idea of Creative Commons, I would send them to the Creative Commons search engine, because that site has its own search engine that then classifies things by images and videos and pictures. So it's just a one-stop shop for them, and they can bookmark it, or you can add it to your class page as just a simple introduction into the different labels.
Great. I also noticed that on YouTube there are some filters as well. Like you can search videos by perhaps not all the Creative Commons, I think, but it's important to notice that you're not supposed to download. So
yeah, and there's a lot of conversations with the kids. They say, well, I can download it and use it as part of my video, but yeah, you're not supposed to. And so we have a lot of talks about that, because it's
though I have noticed that there is a video editor inbuilt in YouTube where you can search by Creative Commons, and you can take different clips and stream them. So you're actually not downloading them, you're reusing them. And then I guess that's a way you could reuse them.
And I think that's such an underused tool. I just learned about that tool maybe last year, and it blew my mind when I first learned about it, because it is such an easy way to take YouTube videos and crop them and make like video study notes and things like that. We recently, with my grade 9 students, did TED Talks, and a lot of the TED Talk videos are Creative Commons listed on YouTube. So they were able to take their favorite parts from several TED Talks as a way to sort of think about how they wanted to get their message across in an effective way. So you're right, that's sort of YouTube's workaround to those copyright laws, is to do it within YouTube, and that's a great tool for it.
Yes, thank you. And so we talked a lot about how students search or create. Do you, I imagine you push them to also publish their work on their Creative Commons?
I do, and I don't. We do both. So some things never leave the sort of classroom environment, because I do also feel that they should feel comfortable, not producing a perfect work, to just, this is our learning place, and we're trying and we're failing and we're getting up and we're trying again. So some things never go public, but more and more as the years continue, I think students are more excited and more willing to publish their things online. They sort of live out loud. And Lawrence Lessig, who wrote the Free Culture book, who is attached to the Creative Commons, talks about how this digital storytelling is the new literacy of this generation. That the pictures and the video footage is the new reading and writing for these kids, and they're excited to post and share and send things around the world. And that's a really good motivator when we're talking about those Creative Commons labels, because I usually start off with this idea that everything they create, they automatically own the copyright to. And they can then decide what they want to do with their work. Creative Commons has a really great tool where it asks you questions about what you want other people to do with your work, and then it creates the label for you. And so the kids get really excited that when they produce a finished piece of work in the corner, they get to decide what their Creative Commons label is going to look like and how other people can use their work that they do share online. So I would say the majority of our work doesn't make it to a public forum, but I feel confident that the activities we do within the protected zone of our domain has prepared them to understand what they need to do if they're going to post things publicly. I feel confident in knowing that they understand what they would need to do to produce a video that they then could go make money off of. They understand how that works and what tools to use. And I think that's important as we see these kids earlier and earlier are being successful with these online pursuits. Part of that is understanding, well, the legalities and the ethics that I hope to explore within the classroom.
Really building on the digital citizenship standard, and also make through their progression, they become more empowered. So, and they make the right choice. They also have a voice. So it's a lot of students' agency as well. So it's like liberating.
Great connection to the new ISTE standards that came out too. One of them is digital citizenship, but one of them is about being an empowered learner and understanding what technology and what tools to use to be a digital citizen. So it all kind of comes into play, and I'm really seeing this idea of finding free to use content coming to the forefront of a lot of trends, magazines, and documents and reports that are coming out.
Yeah. Those standards are very nice. They make a lot of sense. So now that we are towards the end of this hangout, I would like to ask you what would be some of the tips you would give to teachers in order to get more and more comfortable with this, and perhaps some of the best practices you would suggest for schools.
Sure. So there's been some highs and lows on this copyright journey I've been on in and outside of the classroom. And I guess looking back on it, if I were to give advice, one of them would be to keep it simple. I think a lot of educators get afraid of copyright because there are so many things going on, but it doesn't need to be about everything that has to do with copyright. Start small. And kind of work alongside your kids to build it up. So for me, what that meant was making a one-page cheat sheet for my kids. And this one-page cheat sheet they had throughout the different units we studied in the year, but it also followed them from grade 7 to grade 8. So it was this thing that they could continue to refer back to. And it was just 3 different places where they could find Creative Commons materials. So the first one, keep it simple. And I would say the second one is consistency. Are you modeling these behaviors as a teacher? Because if you're using copyrighted material, but then you ask them not to use copyrighted material, I mean, they're going to look at what you're doing over what you're saying. And this is connected to this idea of not just you, but all the teachers in your department. So it sort of has to be consistent across the subjects, across your department, across the different teachers. Because if they go into one classroom and they're allowed to use copyrighted content and another one they're not allowed, they're going to be very confused. That's a confusing message that we're sending them. So we have keep it easy, keep it consistent, and then the last thing is what I found most useful was learning alongside the kids to actually do the projects that you're asking them to do. Model it on the screen in front of them. Be learning beside them and acknowledge that those gray areas exist, and it's up to them to sort of work through what they think is right and wrong. So those would be my big tips when doing copyright, just from what I've sort of picked up over the years.
Thank you so much, Cris. I think we kind of shared a lot of things here, a lot of things about the vision, about the standards, about the resources, and it all makes a lot of sense for, I'm sure, for teachers who are going to watch this. So thank you so much for all your time. and for the great information. So I think we are going to add one document in the description below so that people can find the resources we talked about. So thank you so much, Cris. And
absolutely, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, as part of this Creative Commons field, I share all of my resources. So anything I've designed to help the kids, I'm happy to share out, and we can do that in the links below. So thank you so much again for having me.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.